Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Capitalism, Culture, and Character. My name is Michael Van Pelt, and I am the President and CEO of Cardus. We are a Canadian-based think tank that explores how 2,000 years of Christian social thought can inform the most challenging questions of our day. We're delighted to have you here, and we're also thankful for those who helped make this event possible, and I want to acknowledge them. I want to thank Cameron Stevens, Scott Cameron, so much for their support of this event, for the Caritate Foundation, Rob Alloway, for the Archdiocese of Toronto, welcome His Eminence, Cardinal Collins, thank you. The CLAC, a completely creative and unique union in this country, and of course John and Rebecca Horwood, longtime patrons of Cardus. Now there is, give them a hand, yes, thank you. Now there is one table that I am going to introduce with a little bit more detail, really not detail. We're not going to introduce every table, but this is the most important table, and please, ladies and gentlemen, do not get up and go to that table. It's the book table. Let me introduce you to the book table, ladies and gentlemen. Love Your Enemies, Arthur C. Brooks. The Second Mountain, David Brooks. Fabric of Character, Anne Snyder, and a fascinating book of our Ontario Premier John Roberts, Public Triumph, Private Tragedy by Steve Paikin. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome that table of books to our presence. So we're going to get at it today and just jump right into the content, and I'm so looking forward to our panel coming up. But let's think about this. So where do we turn to? Where do you turn to when an idea seems to run its course or have lost its way? From what well or water source will we find refreshment and inspiration to repair or replace an idea that has brought us great bounty? It's the future of capitalism we're discussing. Is it a good idea gone amok through our own avarice and ignorance? Or is it a delicate idea machine that no longer can absorb new forces and still spit out goodness? Last night at the Munk debate, the motion was this: the capitalist system is broken. It's time to try something different. After the debate, the fight in true Canadian fashion, i.e. everyone was just lovely to each other, here's what the result was. The pro, 45%, and the con, led by two gentlemen you will meet this morning, was 55%. Well, wasn't I relieved? This tepid confidence among a well-heeled group of 3,000 Torontonians at the Roy Thompson Hall, clearly displaying the spoils of their capitalism in the clothes that they were wearing and the shoes that they had, suggests, ladies and gentlemen, that it is time to talk. So today we go a bit deeper. We turn to the world of philosophy, of ethics, of religion, and of the arts. We turn to the discussion of character and of trust. Can these disciplines, can these larger creeds, slightly intimated last night by David on the podium, can they offer renewal and repair? Well, let's get at it. Let's introduce our panel. That's the conversation they're having this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you've seen their bios. I'm not going through a substantive interview. I'm just going to give you a slight thought on each one of them. So I would like to introduce Arthur Brooks. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Brooks, the man who does everything and inspires hope and intellectual rigor all at the same time. Arthur Brooks. David Brooks, whose words of insight snap on the pages of the New York Times, but whose heart is open in his latest book, The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life. Ladies and gentlemen, David Brooks. And Anne Snyder, the author of Fabric of Character, the new editor of Cardus's Comment magazine. That's kind of cool, ladies and gentlemen. The persistent and gentle voice whose ideas resonate for days and weeks after your conversation, and who changes how you think without you even knowing it. Ladies and gentlemen, Anne Snyder. And finally, the most impressive moderator in this country, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Paikin, who single-handedly raises the intellectual capital and dignity in the Canadian public and political life. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Paikin. Here they are.
My goodness. Not much to live up to there, is there? Okay, thank you. Just before we get started here, Anne, where were you born?
Boston.
You're born in Boston. Arthur, where were you born?
Spokane, Washington.
David Brooks, where were you born?
The Salvation Army Hospital in Toronto, Canada.
We have a winner, ladies and gentlemen. Can you imagine that? Did you all know that David Brooks is from Toronto originally?
My daughter plays hockey. It came from that.
Okay, that was a fantastic introduction by our host, and I hate to do this, but since I've been told by so many of you this morning that we were at the Munk debate last night and we don't want to hear the same conversation all over again, there's a thing in football that when the quarterback gets to the line of scrimmage and he sees what the defense has and he realizes that the play they've called is not going to work for that defense, what does he do? He calls an audible. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to call an audible because Arthur and I had a chat last night after the Munk debate, at which time I said to him, are we really going to do this sort of same thing all over again the next morning? And he said, no, let's do something else. I said, great, what do you want to talk about? He said, let's talk about polarization and how we get out of the absolutely appalling and awful tribalism that infects so much of the world today. And then I talked to these two and they said, yeah, good idea. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning, everybody. We'll talk up here for a little while. And then maybe in our last 15 minutes or so, we'll open things up for questions from the floor. We'll have somebody run around with a microphone and roam so that the people recording this can get a good audio recording, and we'll get you involved as well. These seem to be, David Brooks, start us off. These seem to be the end times for the level of political civility, the level of harmony. Are we doomed to this at the moment? Because from up here, from what it looks like, we seem to be. What's your view?
Are these the end times? Well, if you all disappear, we're in the rapture. I'll still be here, probably. Sadly. I'll say two things. One, my observation of Canada is that you guys are more polarized than I've ever seen Canada.
True.
From urban to rural, mostly, from east to west. And yet when I come up here, it feels like I can breathe. I can relax. Because in the US, it's much worse. And there's an attack in Washington, and Arthur can talk to Harvard, or it's just like, are you evil at every turn? And I wrote 16 columns in about 2015 saying, don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination for president. And I was living in Washington, spending a lot of time in New York, and teaching at Yale. So how could I be out of touch with America? And so I've spent the last 3 years trying to recover from that, and often 3 states a week. And one story just rings out as I'm thinking of it. It's a guy I met in South Dakota, a big Trump supporter. And he was 70 and he had his best job when he was 32. And he was the foreman at a section of a plant that did air conditioning. And he got laid off because they got new technology that he was not qualified to supervise. And so he thought he'd disappear from the plant, just leave no traces. So he packs up all his stuff in the office, has a little box, and he opens the door, and he's going to walk to his car. And the 3,500 other people at the plant have created a human column, two lanes, from his office door to the car door in the parking lot. And so he walks through 3,500 people with them applauding him the whole way. And he said that was the best day of my life. And he's been working 38 years since, and every job has been worse. He's now got a mother-in-law who's in her 90s who can't leave. So they're there every day, no vacation every day. And so he said, Trump's got to win. Like, I don't like the guy, but somehow we got to change things. And so my answer is that Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. And so that's the core of our polarization on that side. And then, frankly, I'll say one thing about the debate. I mean, I loved our opponents. I think they were good. They were very good people and very smart, and I thought they did a phenomenal job. But at the end of the day, 45% of the people in that hall think capitalism should be replaced. We're driving here today, like, there's Starbucks, that's capitalism. Like, what? This is one of the most successful cities in the history of the world. What are we talking about? And to me, it's a sense that people are really disenchanted with something, and they're looking for something to tear down. And that on the other side of the aisle is a serious thing to listen to and try to answer.
And do you see any way out of the polarization that infects so much of the world today, particularly in the city in which you live right now, Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, my favorite reason for traveling, not just to Canada, but anywhere else in the U.S. is because it's more hopeful than where we live. And some of that, Washington is a very words city, a messaging city. I call it a hashtag city, where you're filled with isms of debates rooted in ideologies that can sometimes be all head. And I don't believe in doom, but I confess, especially the last couple months, actually, I've just been in a number of gatherings that have been intentionally diverse, and actually intentionally diverse to talk about polarization. And diverse along sort of ideological lines, racial lines, somewhat class lines. And I have left those gatherings almost sometimes to the point of tears. I came home about 2 weeks ago saying, man, the founders of this country really screwed things up for the rest of us 2.5 centuries later, who have to deal with deeply morally divergent narratives, which I think is what is infecting so much of Americans' inability to understand where one another are coming from. It's not just, oh, I disagree with you, it's that your experience, it's almost like God is thrown into the conversation, like if you disagree, you're sort of morally condemned. And there's actually some real historical reasons that are somewhat legitimate for these power plays in any given room. And I find that especially racially right now in the US. Where I find hope tends to be when people get out of the words and the debates, though I loved the debate last night, and when you have a shared project, which tends to be most, they often say local government is working better than national government, et cetera. There is a civic renewal going on in the country. At the same time, our politics has become so nasty. And I think with that, there's just something about a shared orientation and a shared assignment to improve a place where people wind up getting outside of their perceived differences and actually do get to a deeper basic sense of shared humanity. But I'm not finding lots of examples of hope at a huge scale right now.
I think the last time that might have happened for America was in the days after 9/11.
Yeah.
So catastrophe tends to bring that on.
Does that, yeah.
Can you think of an example short of a massive catastrophe like that in which a shared national project might be on the agenda?
If Canada invaded, that would be good.
Well, as Mr. Trump just reminded us, we're not spending enough of our GDP on the military, so I don't think that's about to happen.
Two-faced.
Yes. Any thoughts about that? I mean, one might have thought climate change would have been that, but there's so much disagreement on that as well.
Yeah. I'm having trouble thinking of anything.
Yeah,
I mean, people in some sort of our circles often talk about the need for a new national narrative, and that could unite the sort of old America and new America. Again, that may be something that people who are writers and academics say. I'm not sure if national narratives or national creed any longer kind of hold the uniting sway they once did. But I don't know, maybe you have a national hope.
Arthur, where do you
Sort of,
where do you
besides
see
the
us?
catastrophe galvanizing.
Yeah. How do we come out of this tunnel of polarization?
Well, thank you, and what a delight to be here, and thanks to all of you for supporting this great endeavor. It was really fun last night, but there was a little bit of a pall over the conversation. Should capitalism be replaced? It means that everything is wrong, and since everything is terrible, what are we going to do to replace everything that's terrible? Everything isn't terrible. I mean, it's clear that we're living in the best times we've ever lived in not just the United States and Canada, but all over the world. We have less poverty than we've ever seen. We have more freedom than we've ever seen. We have less childhood mortality. We have higher levels of literacy. And in point of fact, most countries in the world are getting cleaner and have a better environment. I mean, the world is getting better. The trouble is that we have a neurological tendency, we have an evolutionary prerogative of seeing the bad. If I go back 10 and 15 years, all I read is bad news then too. If I go back 30 and 40 years, it's not like when my parents were little, that the newspapers were saying everything was peachy and everything was wonderful and rainbows and dolphins and unicorns. No, it was the same thing. We have a tendency to look at what's wrong and feel rotten about it and wonder, why the world is going to hell. That's just how humans are wired. There's a reason for that too. Your genes wouldn't have passed on through the past 500,000 years if you were smelling the roses while there was a saber-toothed tiger sneaking up behind you. You need to pay attention to what's wrong. That's actually how you stay alive. The problem is that it's misdirected socially. I mean, we have a tendency to use that natural human tendency to be bitter, to be angry about what's wrong. In my work, I try to look at what's coming 2 and 3 years ahead. And it's been a tough time to be looking 2 and 3 years ahead when what we see now was on the horizon. I remember in 2014, I read a very interesting article in a journal called the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the most prestigious academic journal about science for non-scientists. It was written by 3 social psychologists at Northwestern University about a phenomenon called motive attribution asymmetry, which is what we academics do. When you have a simple idea, you put a fancy word on it, and you get tenure. And motive attribution asymmetry is a simple concept. It means it's when you have intractable conflict between any 2 groups of people. Generally speaking, you find an asymmetry in the way that they see themselves and each other. Namely, I'm motivated by love, and you are motivated by hatred, hence we cannot deal with each other. Both sides see this in each other, and therefore cannot, and you'll have intractable conflict sometimes for generations. Obviously, that's a cognitive error because both sides can't be simultaneously motivated by love and hatred. That's the good news, it's an error. The problem is it's very hard to solve. And these authors were looking at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Rwandan genocide, the Balkans. But the reason this got my attention in 2014 was because the authors found the same level of motive attribution asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans in the United States as between Palestinians and Israelis. I'm motivated by love, you're motivated by hatred. Now that was coming down the pike. It arrived. 2 months after that, reading that article, it was really on my heart. And I was doing what I always do. At the time I was running a think tank in the United States called the American Enterprise Institute. And I was traveling around, raising money, giving speeches, and it was a great life because I would talk to all different groups of people and sort of take temperature, not just in major cities. And I was giving a talk a couple of months after I read that article to 600 conservative activists in Manchester, New Hampshire. So 6 really fired up conservative activists in 2014. And I got there a little early to the event, and it was a whole day of speakers. I looked at the program and I noticed I was the only guy not running for president. And I thought, well, that's a mistake. But there aren't any mistakes. There's only opportunities. So I thought to myself, what can I do that they can't? And the answer is I can say exactly what I think. So I did. And the 3 before me, one of them was Donald Trump, by the way, they were doing what politicians always do. They get in front of incredibly partisan, non-mixed audiences and say, you're right, and everybody who's not here is stupid and evil. That's what they do. I mean, that's how you get votes. You're insane not to do that. I mean, God bless them. I'm not a politician. I can't tell them that their business, but I don't have to do that. So I got up in front of this audience and I said, it was a kind of a distinct moment for me, and you'll see why in a second. I said, you know, you've been hearing a lot of things that have earned your applause today, and you agree with them. And by the way, so do I, a lot of the things that you've heard. But I want you to remember the people who aren't here because they wouldn't be comfortable being here. They're political progressives. And I want you to remember that they're not stupid and they're not evil. They're simply Americans who disagree with you on public policy. And if you want to persuade them, which should be your goal, there's only one way that you can do that, and that's with love. It was not an applause line. Thank you. I know. I've been waiting 5 years for this. But this lady got the applause right after she yells out from the audience, "I think they're stupid and evil." Now, it was not to repudiate me. It was a joke. It was a festive environment. There were people with three-cornered hats. I mean, it was not, I mean, and I thought to myself at that moment, this was a real epiphany for me. Morally, I thought of my hometown. I was born in Spokane. I was raised in Seattle, the most left-wing city in America. My mother was an artist and my father was a college professor. What do you think their politics were? Right? I'm the oddball. I'm the black sheep of my family. Let me tell you, they were not stupid and they were not evil. They were great parents who gave me educational values and raised me as a Christian, and I'm so grateful for those things. And by the way, they taught me to think for myself, which I did at great inconvenience to them. So that was motive attribution asymmetry on the part of that audience, on the part of those politicians, on the part of that lady, and it created huge cognitive dissonance for me because I realized that I was insufficiently exhibiting the moral courage that comes not from standing up to the people with whom you disagree. That's easy in a free society. Real moral courage comes from standing up to the people with whom you agree on behalf of those with whom you disagree. That's what my parents taught me, and your parents taught you that too. And I saw this, my friends, is what's coming down the pike. And it did, and it's here. So here's the good news. There's something better coming. Why? Because you cannot maintain this energy, and this is a lot of what this conversation is all about, and I know we'll get into it. But I do see a much better future when 95% of Americans say they hate how divided we become as a country, and I bet it's 99% of Canadians. We have an old saying at my old think tank at AEI, things that can't go on forever won't. And our job as those who are engaged in social renewal, our job for those who believe in brotherhood and solidarity and love for others is to create the social movement that will push people toward what they really want. And I think we can do it.
David, that was,
We had the Civil War. I mean, it can get pretty bad before it gets pretty good.
I'm curious about the fellow you just described. 3 years later, how do you think he feels about his vote for Donald Trump?
Good.
He still does. Do you think his life's any better as a result of that vote?
No.
So why does he still feel good about it?
I spent a lot of time with Trump voters, and they love him more now than before, because he's taking the fight to the people they think look down on them. And resentment's super powerful. And so, like, even the Trudeau moment, I was looking at my Twitter feed, all the progressives on my Twitter feed were saying, this is terrible, Trump can't get along with world leaders. And all the conservatives on my Twitter feed were saying, this is fantastic, Trump can't get along with world leaders. And so they just wanted to throw frankly, a bastard into the system and change it. And they see him owning the liberals. And so their support for him is stronger, and among the senators we all know, the Republicans, they all know that they're less popular in their state than Donald Trump is. And so that's part of it's a social status thing. A lot of this is status related. I'm a moderate, I don't like Trump, but I'm not a progressive. So I get attacked from both sides. And it's interesting because the attack from the right, from the Trump side, is from an idea of perceived inferiority. And you think you're better than me, I hate you. From the progressive side, it's from a perception of assumed superiority. And so it's ridicule and scorn. And so it's very interesting to be in my position, to be to have these two different flavors of attack. And so we're status conscious. And so you get this, a lot of this is about status. I was thinking as Arthur was talking what the root of this, and I have a theory. Part of it is spiritual. We all spend a lot of our time thinking about spiritual life. And we've become spiritually denuded in the country. And there's just something happening. Part of it I don't understand. Why has the teenage suicide rate in the US gone up 70% in the past 6 years? Why has the college depression rate gone up doubled in the last same period? Somebody did a study at the University of Michigan on empathy. I'm not sure I believe in studies on empathy, but according to the studies, it's down 40%. There's a guy who does a study on creativity over the last 30 years. Suddenly creativity rates among college students has collapsed. Like, I don't understand what's in the water, but something's in the water, and it's created a feeling of emotional panic and a sense of, I need to attack in order to make myself whole. And we're just living in the middle of that. And I've created this little program at the Aspen Institute called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, which is an attempt to help people get better at relationships and to help people get better at building community. And I think it's that elemental essence of, how do I get to know you? How do I see you? How do you see me? How do I make myself available to be seen? And I think it's at that fundamental spiritual and emotional level that our problems reside. And I don't ever make this case in public, but some people do, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but it's like, you lose the faith element of your society, you're fragile. And somehow I think that it's that deep that whatever it is we're dealing with.
And it's not exactly as if there's a lack of religiosity in American politics these days, though, right? I do remember when Jeb Bush came up to Toronto to give a speech many years ago, and before he gave the speech and before we dove into lunch, he sat around one of these tables and he leaned over to me and he said, "Are we not going to say grace before we have our meal?" And I said, "Well, we don't really do that in Canada." And he just shook his head and could not believe it.
Yeah.
There's tons of religiousness, there's tons of spirituality and religiosity in American public life.
Right.
And yet something's missing. What do you see?
I think it's a great question, and getting to know Canada since stewarding Comment magazine, which I'm loving, but coming up here is at once always so refreshing because there is that loveliness that Michael described after a heated debate. But it is more secular. And I grew up in New England. I grew up in a very secular part of the U.S., but I'm struck by how sort of civic religion remains a part of our forms, our ceremonies, et cetera. I think right now there's a couple things going on. There's a lot of hand-wringing in the U.S. around the seeming sort of moral incomprehensibility of evangelicals, particularly white evangelical support for Trump, the same people who would have been aghast at, say, Bill Clinton's behavior that was different, but anyways, there's just a lot of like, how can these folks support a man who's had these marriages, et cetera? And I think what you see is just a lot, religion is an end, not a means. It's become an identity. It's become wrapped up in sort of a tribal sense of belonging that is often very fear-based, I think you find, and we need to protect. Religion is sort of a tribe we belong to, less a way of life. And somehow that's like, I would call, I'm outing myself and my views here, but I would call that sort of a spiritual impoverishment of what religion is actually meant to offer you. And these needs, we're talking about tribalism, there's something like so primordial in what it is. I don't know if some of you probably read the Sebastian Junger book some years ago, just called Tribe, and it brings out just the ways in which, there's something natural and human about membership, about wanting to belong, about actually, we don't fear suffering so much. Arthur made this point last night, we fear not being needed. And there's just a lot of that right now, I think particularly for young people and some middle-aged, and it's hitting men worse than it's hitting women. And in that desire to somehow feel needed, if the institutions are no longer there to grab your sense of purpose and activate it and get you animated to care about a context beyond yourself that's tangible and that you can see the contribution of your role, then I think you revert to these it's actually almost like a religious spiritual impulse, but it's manifesting what I would call a very pagan way. You revert to these kind of tribal tendencies that get very hot and furious.
Arthur, can you help explain this, certainly to me, maybe not to this audience, and this, I'm going to get on your bad side right now by asking this question, I suspect, but I've talked to a lot of people in Canada who do not understand how God-fearing religious people in the United States can be so utterly supportive of a man who pays porn stars to keep their secrets, who has cheated on every wife he's got, he does not lead the life of a spiritual, good Christian man.
Right.
And yet they are in the tank for him 100%. Can you explain that to us?
Donald Trump is a walking middle finger. And you have to understand, when you have a fear-based politics in the wake of a horrible financial crisis that disproportionately affected the second quintile in the income distribution. The financial crisis did not affect people at the very bottom of the income distribution in the United States because they were not earning income to begin with. It was the second quintile, the working poor and the working lower middle class, that were ravaged by the financial crisis. And there was a belief, and there was a correct belief, by the way, that people in Washington and on the coast didn't care about them. And finally somebody came along who said, I'm going to fight for you. It's very interesting. I have my own family is pretty progressive, and the people that I come from. But my own kids, I have 3 kids, and my 2 older sons who've moved out. One lives a Catholic religious vocation and is very anti-Trump. The other is a farmer, didn't go to college. He's joining the U.S. Marine Corps, and he'll say to me, he says, Dad, you know why we love Trump? I'll say, no, son, tell me. He says, because he fights for people like me. And I say, you mean, affluent kids from Bethesda? But that's not his point. So the point that David and Anne are getting at, I think quite correctly, is that when you have a culture, when you have a political culture that's motivated by fear, people act in funny ways. The real question is, how do you neutralize a culture of fear? Now, Trump is a bully. People actually don't like, there's a lot of literature on bullies, a little social psych literature on bullies. Even people who, if it's your bully, you still don't like them. People use bullies. Bullies believe that they're loved. They're not loved. They're despised. The problem is that we have to get into an equilibrium where people will reject their own bully. We're not there yet. And the only way that we can do that is by doing the only thing that you can is to change the polarization of American politics. You see, I'll speak as an economist for a second, in the 15 years after a financial crisis, which happens 2 times a century in most developed economies, you have 15 years of fear-based politics in which, on average, I have data on 800 elections over 120 years in 20 advanced economies, including the United States and Canada, that shows that on average in the 10th year after a financial crisis, you have a 30% bump in the voter share for populist-based parties and politicians. It's Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders by the numbers, my friends. There's nothing mysterious about this because we're in a fear-based cycle where we feel that I'm not getting mine and I'm at tremendous exposure, and the rich people or somebody or immigrants or wily foreigners or whatever are going to take my stuff. How do you repolarize that? There's only one thing that repolarizes any kind of fear. Perfect love drives out fear. You actually need to be quite cognizant of the real problem. And David touched on it. He said there's this malaise among young people. Did you know in the United States that people in their 20s today are a third less likely to be in love than people were when I was that age? Is there anything that brings you more misery than a lack of romantic love? It's the life in life. This is God's gift to us, is love. It's the nuclear fuel rods of happiness. And so if we want, so David's project, Weave, you have to check it out at the Aspen Institute. It's very important because what it's trying to do is to find institutions that will create the connective tissue between humans and create the ecosystem where love can reside. What I'm really interested in, what I'm paying a lot of attention to, is what I call the Startup Life Project. People talk about entrepreneurship a lot. This is one of the most entrepreneurial cities in the world, Toronto, of course. But starting businesses is the most boring of all entrepreneurial activities. Why? Because the real enterprise is your life. The real startup of your life is taking risk with your heart for explosive rewards. And the best way that you can do that is by falling in love and declaring your love for other people. What I want is cultural renewal on the basis of risk, and that's what I've been doing, going from campus to campus all over the place. I mean, I give a lot of commencement addresses. And the thing that the last charge I'll leave them with is, if you consider yourself an entrepreneur, you have 2 weeks to declare your love for somebody. Call somebody up and say, I love you. Are you tough enough to do, you're not enough of an entrepreneur to do that? That's the kind of movement that we actually need, and that person by person by person by person will repolarize our culture and ultimately work on our politics.
David, if that's right, who's the perfect love candidate for the Democrats? The antidote to Trump.
As Arthur was talking, I realized I'm actually married to one of the three of us, or one of you two, and it's not the person with my last name.
That's good.
So
David and I are not married. I want to emphasize that for his evidence. There's got a table of priests over there getting nervous.
Well, I guess the first thing to say is there's an interesting contrast in the Democratic field on those who talk about fighting and those who don't.
Right.
And so we have this polarization, this division on the basis of ideology, where we assume that Sanders and Warren are on the left and most other people are on the middle. But we also have a fighting versus non-fighting. And it's interesting to me, the person who spoke most about fighting was Kamala Harris, who's now out of the race. And the other person who spoke most about fighting was Warren, who's sinking right now. And as far as I know, Pete Buttigieg has never used the word fight in this campaign. And he is surging. And so just in the level of the campaign, to me right now, and this may be part of I don't totally agree with your theory on the economic determinism of what we're going through. I halfway believe in it. The fact that we're becoming a no majority country, I think, is a pretty significant effect here. And the social crisis, I think, is also. But I think exhaustion is now becoming a more powerful driver than hatred. And that's why I think Buttigieg, like the guys, I met him like 3 weeks before he announced. I happened to be sitting next to him at a dinner. And when he announced, I thought, wait, I remember that guy. He was like mayor of some small town in Indiana. And he was 37 years old. And yet he's done very well, and I've had dinner with him since. And I've had a chance, because of my job and where I work, to interview all the presidents, except for the current one, dozens and dozens of times. And when I leave all those interviews, I think, that's impossible. That job is impossible. Because the President of the United States, and it's premier here, you wake up at 8:30, you get the national security brief, and then you're greeting the women's championship volleyball team from the University of Washington, and then you've got domestic policy, and then you've got Israel, and then you've got something else. It's impossible. And yet, having spent time with Buttigieg, I leave those meetings and think, plausible. He could do the job as well as anybody. And so he is a character of let's just relax and talk to each other and be normal. When I covered the end of the Soviet Union, the end of apartheid, normalcy was a gigantic word. Let's just be normal. And I do think there's a hunger for that kind of normalcy, which he sort of fulfills.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, because you mentioned Israel in the midst of all that, and I don't want to sound like I'm picking on the evangelical community with the previous question to Arthur, but so let me pick on the Jewish community as well. The Jewish community is in the tank for Trump because he's moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and therefore he can do no wrong. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure Jewish voters in the U.S., they're pretty progressive and they're pretty democratic. I think it'd be tough to live in New York, but the Orthodox community.
Yeah.
And he has been supportive of Likud. And my son served in the Israeli army. I have very complicated views about all the issues there. My attitude towards some of the evangelical voters toward Israel is I'm really glad you support Israel. Maybe a little less. It's always move to Damascus. You guys should take over Damascus. It's no, I don't think so. And so I do think that is, as Arthur was saying and as Anne was saying, when evangelical, this is one of Anne's sayings, when evangelical becomes a noun and not an adjective, it turns into a problem. It should be a way of practicing the faith, not a tribe you're a member of. And it's become like, oh, we all hate the same enemies. And oh, we all hate the Muslims. And if that's your motivation, you've got a problem. And so I do think, my son left the Israeli army, and he was a sniper in Gaza and the West Bank. He left with a very complicated view of the situation there.
Where is he now?
He's now, he decided he liked protecting people, so he's getting a master's in criminal justice to become a cop or something.
In the States?
In the States. Huh. You should go into that place with a complex view. And I've just written a piece I'm proud of for Comment on the Jewish view of Jesus. And one of the, I don't know how many people here have practiced faith or how many people have not been to Israel. But if you go to Israel, the thing you get impressed with is it is a literal, spiritual, and metaphorical battleground, and it has been for 2,500 years. And so you see the complexity of all that, and you see what any Arab or any Jew or what Jesus walked into was just a maelstrom of conflict. And to be him in that context was a radical act of difference. But you become aware of the complexity of that view. Many years ago, there was a horrible mass murder at the grave of Abraham in Hebron. And I was there the week before, and this was by a Jew named Baruch Goldstein who killed Muslims. And the Christians, Jews, and Muslims had joint protection of this site, a holy site for all three religions. And the Jews were allowed to sweep, the Christians were allowed to mop, and I forget what the Arabs did, maybe they cleaned the windows. But the sense was that mopping was more ownership than sweeping, and a little more than
window washing.
I remember it was like a successful way to deal with our differences. But that takes a level of awareness of each other that is rare. Yeah. But if you operate in that world successfully, that's what you have to learn to do.
Anne, I see you scribbling notes there. Is something you wanted to add on that? No, that's different?
Good.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Well, I will say one thing
Sure, please.
that has been coming to mind in this whole discussion. A number of weeks ago, I saw a film that I commend to all of you. Actually, I think it comes out in a week, but when you're with a magazine, you get to watch things earlier. And it's called A Hidden Life and it was directed by a film director named Terrence Malick, who some of you may know is incredible, rather avant-garde, famous for a number of films, one of which was Tree of Life. And A Hidden Life is about actually a man who is not that well known, at least in my world, but I think has since been canonized by the Catholic Church. A Catholic man who was with his family in rural Austria at the time when Austria had been taken over by Germany, and it's set in like the early 40s. And without giving too much away, it's really the story of very hidden resistance. He winds up not joining Hitler's army, but being imprisoned for it. And no one knew about this, and it's like a searing, it's probably, for anyone of Christian faith, it's probably the most cruciform film I've ever seen. But there's a line in it towards the end when the protagonist, the hero, is in the sort of worst stage of his prison sentence, and he's alone in his cell. And the whole film, in a lot of ways, is about tribalism and the fury that sweeps up this seemingly innocent agrarian community as they are hearing words and sort of about race and about who's superior and defending your community. And this man who's made these choices to not join Hitler's army is being abandoned, including by the local Catholic priest, for putting the community in danger and putting his family in danger. So he's racked by all these moral choices he's making, which we would now in retrospect obviously see as very black and white, but in the moment were very, very fuzzy, and the punishments were fatal. And he's in his prison cell, and he just says, looking at the light streaming in, and he's writing a letter to his wife, when you give up, what I've learned is when you give up the right to survive, a new light floods in. And I just thought it was a beautiful line that's actually very apropos to our moment of tribalism right now, where there is, like we were all saying before, there is this instinct, I think, at root of tribe is some self-protection, and whether it's evangelicals trying to protect their sort of brand or way of life because of fears that I don't always think are justified, but are real. It's trying to figure out what allows you, what love is great enough, whether vertical or horizontal, to allow you to get rid of that, to sort of consider your rights a loss. And I think, that's sort of an ultimate individual surrender, but I sometimes think that's the only thing that will allow us to get past our instinct to withdraw and protect our own, and sometimes in very ugly ways. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
Okay, your turn. We, in our remaining moments here, would like to take some questions from the floor. So I know it is a typical trait of a Canadian audience that no one wants to go first. So do we have any Americans here who want to ask the first question? Thank you, sir, for getting us started. Ray, if you would, the microphone to this gentleman in the middle of the room, and we'll get started with questions.
I'm actually not American, but I will get this party started, I guess. One of the things that I was wondering, and I think both David and Anne have touched on it, is the role of place in polarization. Primarily, and this was especially David who talked about this, was the divide that we have between rural and urban America. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more about how maybe there's an intersection between the place where people live and the polarization that they experience, as well as maybe the roots of their resentment as they've watched, essentially their farms, emptied out by agribusiness, then their towns emptied out by offshoring, and then their lives emptied out by pharmaceuticals. And maybe there is some resentment on their part of both left and right, of those who live in the urban centers that they see as having essentially eviscerated their way of life, and religion being essentially all they have left.
Gotcha. David, you want to start on that?
Yeah, we're flying down to North Carolina later today, and I was in a town called Wilkesboro, we're going to Winston-Salem, but Wilkesboro is a small town of 3,000 an hour outside. And Wilkesboro was home of Lowe's Hardware, which is a big hardware chain.
Yeah.
It was the place where NASCAR was invented, and it was the place where Holly Farms was invented. And all those three companies have left. And so Wilkes went through its opioid crisis in the 90s. And there was no place for people in that town to gather. There was a bowling alley, but it burned down. And so the teenagers had to drive an hour to Winston-Salem to have a coffee shop. And so that's what a lot of rural America is like. And yet what's been inspiring to me is how well they're building back. There are now coffee shops, there are now health clubs. They love their place, they're not moving out. My original impulse was, get the heck out of here, go to Phoenix. But their roots are in Wilkes. And I met a guy who started a local brewery, moonshine, which is their specialty. And then you find these people in small towns. I was in Nebraska, and another similar town. I met a woman with 9 kids, runs triathlons, school bus driver, swim team coach, substitute teacher, runs local music festival. Like in these small towns, everybody has 9 jobs. And so I've been heartened by the level of, even if it's national dysfunction, by the local repair. And so with this Weave project, I've been in probably 40 states in the last 3 years. And whether it's in rural Nebraska or urban New Orleans, the people I meet with who are really healing community and building relationship use the same language. It's radical mutuality. We're not helping others. We're all broken. We're just helping each other. It's radical hospitality. You knock on my door, I'm going to open it wider than you ever think. And one of the things that heartens me about the local areas that I go to or the urban areas is that where we live and where Arthur lives in the Boston area, if you knocked on your neighbor's door at 8:30 at night, it would be the most outrageous violation of privacy ever. But in a lot of these places, like I say, I was at some dinner in New Orleans. I said, the problem is none of us know our neighbors. And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? We all know our neighbors. And I've told the story many times. A woman in Florida we ran into, she was helping the elementary school kids out of the classroom across the street till they go home. And we said to her, do you have time to volunteer in your community? And she said, no. And we said, are you being paid for this? And she said, no, I do this to help the kids across the street. What are you doing next? Well, on Thursdays, I take food to the hospital for the sick people. Do you have any time to volunteer? No, I have no time to volunteer. And it was like, this is just what she considered neighboring. And so the hope for me is that at the national level, we look pretty diseased, but at the local level, we look pretty repairing.
And there's often like a disconnect between those two facts that you just said in one person. And I don't know enough about this, but I would love to collect more stories. I've been hearing about a series of fairly echoing stories in a variety of rural communities throughout the U.S. where the very people that might be most vocal, at least in our polls, in say on the immigration issue in a pretty anti-way, are some of the most hospitable people in when a series of set of refugees comes and so on. And you hear these stories of like actually amazing pluralism working itself out around tables in a civic environment, and they're very open to saying, yes, these people are actually revitalizing even our sort of moral sensibilities as a community, but that's somehow not often reflected in kind of the political fears. And there's some great psychologists who can make sense of that, but personal encounter doesn't always change politics.
Can I ask the audience a quick question? Please. Just curiosity. Is Paul Bourne and the Tamarack Institute well known here?
Say the name again?
Paul Bourne.
Paul Bourne, Tamarack Institute? I don't think so.
Okay. Mary Gordon, Roots of Empathy?
Roots of Empathy, on the program I do, we've had,
okay.
we've done something on that.
Because Paul Bourne Tamarack is like the model of poverty reduction. It's in Ontario. So anyway, just curious.
Good. Yes, right here, please. Roots of Empathy is great. Yeah, they are impressive.
Fox News. If Fox News was around in Nixon's day, would he have been impeached?
Arthur?
If Fox News was around in Nixon's day, would Nixon have been impeached? Fox News is a consequence, not a cause of the problems in the United States. One of the encouraging and discouraging things about democratic capitalism is that both democracy and capitalism, they tend to follow the demand curve of society. They affect it too, don't get me wrong. There's some endogeneity in there. But one of the things that we see is that businesses respond to market signals. And when there's no longer an appetite for it in the United States, Fox News will suddenly change. And I strongly predict that within 4 or 5 years, Fox News will be a different phenomenon, as will MSNBC and the similar products all across the political spectrum in the United States that are polarizing. They look like they're pushing the polarization. They are involved in the polarization process, but fundamentally they are a consequence of the fact that people have these impulses per se. So I think that it's impossible that Fox News would have existed under that that ecosystem. It came to be in 1996, and 1 year later, MSNBC came into existence. It was actually in the late 80s that a run-up in trust in the press started to deteriorate rapidly in the United States. It was during the George H.W. Bush administration. 1988 is when you actually see the bottom start to drop out on trust in the press, as well as many other institutions. There's literally only one government institution in America where trust is high and getting higher, and that's the US military. Every other institution is falling, and it's also the case with the press and civic institutions that trust is falling apart. It was in the late 80s and early 90s, before Fox News came into existence, that there was a lot of questioning of the veracity of press reports, about the integrity of journalists that was coming around. And there are a lot of different hypotheses about whether that existed. A lot of it has to do with right-wing talk radio, which has had a much more, I think, metastatic force on the polarization of American politics than the TV networks have.
In the back here.
David, in your most recent book, you seem to indicate we're in a transition period between moral ecologies, and that's part of our cultural moment. What do you think the polarization and the intensity we have right now how much is it because of that transitional phase that we're in, and if anyone else can speak on, what moral ecology do we think might be coming on the outside of this transition period?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason we're tribal is because if you leave human beings spiritually alone and socially alone. They do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, and they revert to tribe. And to me, tribe is a word that's complicated because my Native American friends love the word. But the way I'm using it here is a little different. It's the opposite of community. Yeah. Community is based on mutual love for a place or an idea, and tribe is based on mutual hatred for another. And so tribalism is a scarcity mentality, not an abundance mentality. It's a zero-sum game. It's us versus them. It's conflict. It's war. And that's the mentality we're into. And I just think it's part of 60 years. I'm a cultural determinist. I think culture shapes most things. And our norms about individualism versus the group have shifted over 70 years. So if you grew up in the 50s and you lived in Chicago, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski. It was your local neighborhood, your local parish. It was your local butcher shop. That was your place. And you were ensconced in relationship. There was not much TV, not much air conditioning, and the kids were running in from house to house. There were coffee clutches, there were babysitting co-ops. As one historian said, you had to be a very determined loner to be alone in such a place. And we shifted out of that because we had to shift away from a society that was too racist, too sexist, too anti-Semitic, too boring. The food was awful. And you know, to me, the highlight, the symptom of that cultural shift was in American football, Super Bowl III, where the Baltimore Colts had a quarterback named Johnny Unitas, who was a very 50s guy, like haircut, crew cut, yeah. High top sneakers, very boring, good player, but just like an organization man. And the other side of the field on my team was the New York Jets quarterback, Joe Namath, who had long hair, a swinger, anti-institutional. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. And so that was individual self-expression. And we've now had 60 years of that. And we've had individual self-expression of the right, which is economic individualism, of the left, which is lifestyle, but it's been individualism all the way down. And so we've attenuated the connections between each other. So I think what we're hungering for and what we're searching for is some sort of way of reconnecting to each other. And tribalism is a way to attempt to do that. But to me, the key words in our society for the first time in my lifetime are not freedom. It's connection. And we're just looking for that way to connect.
Too much bowling alone.
Can I speak up for individualism for a second? David and I have this conversation a lot. We've been friends for a long time. And I'm always a little bit more on the individualistic side than David is. And one of the things that has repaired American society significantly and consistently, in my view, has been in times after, for example, after the Civil War, what created a much more unified understanding of American society was the self-improvement revolution that happened after the Civil War. And the self-improvement revolution had a tremendous communitarian aspect to it. It was the evangelical churches sweeping across in tent revivals. It was the temperance movement. But it was also the idea that, you know, Andrew Carnegie built 2,509 English-speaking libraries for the working man, such that you can be your own CEO. It was the idea that Dale Carnegie had when he wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People, that everybody has greatness within. And it became kind of the civic religion, that the individual had primacy, the individual had greatness. And of course you need community. That was the whole concept behind Go West, Young Man, which is a big deal in Canada too. You know, the thing that actually distresses me, I believe that every community should be able to repair itself, of course, but it distresses me just as much that geographic mobility in the United States, people moving, has been cut more than in half since 1980. You know, according to census data in the United States, when I was a kid, 1 in 5 families would move any given year. And we had, you know, we knew our neighbors, but 1 in 5 families would move in any given year. It's less than 1 in 10 right now. We're demobilizing people with welfare systems. People still don't know each other. We do have an opioid crisis, and yet people are stuck in these places that don't have. They feel they don't have agency. They don't have a sense of their own greatness. They're stuck in a place where there isn't any opportunity. I filmed a documentary last year, and part of it was filmed in a little town in Kentucky called Inez, Kentucky, where where Lyndon Johnson kicked off his war on poverty. And this is where we're going to renew America, make this a community of opportunity in 1964. Today, 29% of adults are in the workforce. Why? Because there aren't coal jobs. It should be an X town. They don't need Donald Trump. They don't need opiates. They need U-Haul. It's very important to remember that the sense of self-determinism is integral to the understanding of the North American spirit. And that's one of the things. So just a word for individualism, that's impossible to parse out from what I think the solution to our problem actually is.
Part of my job as moderator is to make sure we finish on time. So this has got to be the last question, I'm afraid, right here.
Okay, no pressure. All right. You've talked a lot about tribalism, and there's a place where tribalism flourishes in great measure, and that is social media. And you haven't really touched on the social space or the social square, but in many ways it's kind of replaced the public square, especially for the young people you were talking about. And the impact of that is not only that they don't necessarily feel the need to get out and engage with their physical neighbor, they're no longer able to. They've lost a lot of the skills socially and that can explain some of the anxiety you're talking about. So I'd like your perspective on the role of the social space in both damaging and potentially repairing the kind of polarization we've been discussing.
Who wants to? Anne, you want to start on that one?
Yeah.
I'm such a Luddite. I'm very, I'm probably in some ways the oldest one here in my not being pro-social media. I'm going to let them answer on the hope question. I think it's just been really damaging. It's just been really damaging, and I wish I were more nuanced on it, but I'm not.
There's a lot of research on this, by the way, and the research is very clear now. I mean, as the people who talk about climate science always talk about this, the science is settled. In this case, the science is settled. People who use social media less than half an hour a day have higher levels of social connection because they use it to find out what's going on with their real relationships. People who use it for more than half an hour a day are substituting their social media relationships for their in-person relationships. Social media, when it's a complement in your life, is beneficial. When social media is a substitute for real human-to-human relationships, where neuroscientists talk about how eye contact creates, this stimulates a hormone, a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. No oxytocin. That's the love molecule. You don't get it from social media, and so you're getting a counterfeit substitute that gives you really no satisfaction. It frays all sorts of bonds that actually should exist. And so net, given the fact that most people use social media, use it for hours a day, net, it is a net social bad.
Okay, hope. I agree. I mean, I mentioned the 70% rise in suicide. That's the smartphone. And it's just, we're not wired for imperfect communication. For ego-driven communication. Like Instagram is, look, my life is better than yours. Twitter is, look, your opinion is dumber than mine. I mean, that's imperfect communication. I do think when new technologies come in, we don't know how to use them. And so we all see the upside. I'm not giving away my phone. But we figure out the downsides, and then we adjust. And I think we're in the process of adjusting. I have this conversation everywhere I go. And everybody says, how do I use this thing correctly? And we have a friend named Andy Crouch, you may know Andy. Yeah. And so Andy, he has a rule. He says, when I wake up in the morning, I go outside and I look at the sky before I look at my phone. And just to root himself, he takes phone Sabbaths of 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, I think 1 month a year, a week a year or something. He takes phone Sabbaths. And he tries to figure out how to use this. I was out at Facebook 2 weeks ago, and it's an awesome facility, by the way, but I was struck having many conversations, including with Zuckerberg, was this is the business that is about the social network. These people are engineers. They have no clue. And they just, like Zuckerberg, and he says it, I'm an engineer, I don't think about this, I don't think in these terms. But somehow we have to find a way to use Facebook and Instagram and Twitter to be products for good. I'm not sure Twitter can happen, but Instagram or Facebook really can be. They've launched these Facebook groups, and Facebook groups can be a source if we use them correctly to create the real community.
Yeah, the complementarity.
And you had mentioned that which is very true. And with our Weave project, the group that's most enthusiastic about our project are people between 18 and 24. Because they say, we don't know how to do relationship. And teach us. It's just basic skill building. Yeah. What do you say to a person who's depressed?
Courage building.
And courage building, right. Yeah. And so somehow if we can use Facebook to teach those basic skills, then we can use the technology. And while I was out there recently, somebody was telling me how the technology is improving. And they were saying in 5 years, none of us will be using our thumbs on the text. You'll just talk into the phone, and the other person will talk back to you. And I said, so it's a phone. But my basic view is people figure stuff out.
Optimism.
What a fantastic way to start the day. I know all of you want to join me in thanking these three for such a spectacular morning. Wonderful, wonderful.
Well, thank you, Steve, and the panel. The sign behind you says that Cardus is about promoting a flourishing society through research, public dialogue, and commentary. I'm not sure we're always used to having quite this much intellectual protein for breakfast, but I think you certainly have achieved what we were looking for, and that is, last night we were talking about capitalism, and you talked about capitalism being really a means of getting knowledge and looking for the market signals and price and being able to make choices. We finished up this morning talking about skills. And part of the skills is not only being able to use words, but finding words that capture more than the reductionist sort of way that people live so much of their lives. And I think this morning you've equipped us with words that balance out between our individual responsibility, meaning, hope, and purpose, our own telos, if you will, as well as the fact that we live together in society with people who are different than us. And we need to, in a context of pluralism, also learn how to understand, deal, and love people, even who are different with us. So for that challenge this morning, we thank you very, very much. My task is a very straightforward one. I have a threefold thank you. First of all, to our panelists for giving of their time this morning, to Steve for moderating. Thank you all very much for this. Secondly, to our sponsors. They were mentioned earlier, but I'd like to mention them again as a think tank. Cardus is a charitable organization, and we're not able to do any of the work we do without the very generous support of philanthropists, not just the ones who are sponsors of this event and named in your program, but the many who do provide support. We want to thank you and acknowledge the fact that we are but stewards of the trust that you put in us. We seek to do that faithfully. Before this morning, especially Cameron Stevens, Caritate Foundation, the Archdiocese of Toronto, Christian Labour Association of Canada, and John and Rebecca Horwood. Let's thank them and all of our supporters once again. Michael indicated at the beginning that there is a table of honor, the book table. The most recent books by each of our four panelists is there on the side for purchase, and there is even, since this is sort of a market crowd, if you will, there is even discounts on some of them, from what I understand, that you can get at your local bookstore. So for those of you who have either Scottish or Dutch background and are looking for thrift along the way, there is a way to exercise thrift this morning by purchasing books. We also, this is sponsored by Cardus, and one of our publications at Cardus is Comment. Comment is sort of our intellectual hub, our thought journal, if you will. It comes out on a quarterly basis in print form, and you get a fresh weekly essay. And David already teased the fact that in the next issue, one of the feature articles is going to be an article by David Brooks on the Jewish view of Jesus. And the theme of the article, of the issue, is tribalism. So if you are not a subscriber, there is a card on your table, and it says, yes, I would like to subscribe to Comment. We're going to make it very easy. Just put in your name and email address, and our office will be in touch. Or if you want to solve it all this morning, if you go over to the comment table at the side, we can process that, $30 a year for subscription. And we are a charitable organization, so if you want to make that a more generous subscription, we're always open to that possibility as well. So capitalism, culture, and character is what you came for this morning. We did call an audible, and you ended up with a little more of thinking of how tribalism intersected with us, but we trust that you've been stimulated. We thank you for your interest and for your support, because obviously you can't have conversations by yourself. They're called monologues, and they're kind of boring. But you've joined us this morning for a conversation, and I hope this marks just the beginning and not the end of our time together. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.